just kidding.
Come to order.
All right, the record reflect we are back in session. Parties and counsel are present, all members of our jury and our alternates are present, and Mr. Arms, you may begin with your closing statement.
Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this case is about the defendant and his means, motive, and opportunity to commit this heinous set of 4 murders. A defendant who had the means and tools capable of carrying out a crime. He's a manufacturer. He works with tools. He has a truck capable of transporting evidence away from the scene. You saw that truck up close and personal. He has the familiarity with the home, the victims, and the animals. He's not a stranger kicking in the door and committing a brutal home invasion robbery type murder. He'd be someone, if he knocked on the door, they would let in. He would be someone that the dogs would have been familiar with and would not have necessarily caused a ruckus. He knew the ins and outs of that layout of that house. He knew they were involved in painting. He knew the victims. The only reason to kill, especially the kids, if not just Summer, in addition, is to eliminate the eyewitness who knows who the killer is. He had time to accomplish it. The night of the 4th, he's off the grid, in either airplane mode, powered off. And when he comes back to life on the network at 9:32, he's south of his home, not the towers he normally hits. He's familiar with that area where the graves are dug and buried. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, these graves weren't that deep. The excavation only went down 18 to 24 inches in each of those graves. In soft, wet, rain-soaked desert, that would not have taken long for a person to dig, bury, cover up. Obviously not covered up really well given the heavy rains and the animal activity. But again, familiar with the areas because his sister lives here, his brother lived in Hesperia at the time. This shows the defendant had more than just the means to commit the crime. He also had a motive. He had a motive to erase the debt. And this is where it's important to talk about the misrepresentation of this spreadsheet by Mr. Sjogren. You have 3 versions of this to look at, where you have this Provecho disaster totaling $34,000, where the defendant has been overpaid $9,000 already through 12/2 of 2008. And in 2008, all of that was being attributed to the defendant in that side box calculation. In 2009, that side box calculation continued, and it continued with that $34,000 being attributed solely to the defendant in that side box, and showing this overpayment now of $23,000 as it progressed into 2009. And then lastly, in 2009, that side box in the second version of 2009, the Provecho disaster here at $34,000. But then, when you get to the email of February 1st, it's now $19,000. It's like roughly half. And why is that?
How? Split it. I was supposed to give him back $19,000 over a period of time. You remember, I know you gotta remember that.
So when you go back to that email that totals $42,000, it showed that that debt for Provetro disaster was only $19,000. It had changed between the spreadsheet and that email being sent. And it's consistent with the defendant's own admission during the jailhouse visit with Kathy Jarvis, a piece of evidence Mr. Schongren either conveniently overlooked or intentionally disregarded because his mission was to downplay the debt the defendant had, despite the evidence being consistent in front of his face. He's the only person benefiting after the disappearance of the McStays. He's the one benefiting from the forged and cashed checks for projects that haven't been started or completed. He's the one that runs a consistent negative balance in his bank accounts until such time as the McStays disappear, and all of a sudden has a huge spike in February 2010 to over $7,000. He has a motive to not be sidelined from this business. You know from those spreadsheets as well that he was in fact being sidelined. You don't have to believe just MacGyver and Susan and Mike. You can listen to the evidence of Joe Cicada. What was it Joe Cicada told you? That was that meeting with Joseph McStay, who said, well, you can keep paying him if you want, but we're doing all the work. What did the spreadsheet show? All of a sudden, towards the end of October 2009, towards the beginning of October 2009, Metro Sheet Metal and Dimick were added as payees in this table. All of a sudden, the defendant's being sidelined and money is being diverted to Metro Sheet Metal and others instead of going to the defendant. By taking Joe out of this process, he regains that control over that process. He can keep the business. He's the one doing all the work, supposedly, already, right? He can keep making big custom waterfalls and keep all of the money and not have to split it with Joseph or anyone else. He prevents that gravy train, all of that money that was coming in over those years, from derailing. All of that money, and where did it go? All of that money when he still ran zero to negative balances in his bank accounts. All of that money that was taken out at casinos, purportedly to be used for gambling purposes. Where did all that money go? Transaction by transaction, you heard. How about not being reported for theft and forgery? Remember, you heard in the defendant's own statement in February 17th, 2010, to Detective DeGaulle. Remember the exchange about having a warrant for his arrest for a probation violation and was going to take care of it the next day? Well, wouldn't that be a motivator for not going back to jail if you've been caught forging checks from your employer?
Not object as to improper argument and ask.
Overruled.
What motivates a man to commit a crime of killing an entire family of 4, including 2 young children? Money, greed, self-interest. That money and that greed, that even according to their own expert, was a huge loss of EIP income. His cut went from 65% to 15% in October. That's a roughly 77% loss in income that he had to find a way to recoup. That loss of income would make it a lot harder to pay back that $42,000 he clearly owed Joe. And forging a check for $6,500 wasn't going to make up for it. Forging a check for $2,500 was not going to make up for it. to show you how central that was a motivator, that greed and self-interest was to the defendant on those days and at that time. Think about what he told detectives.
If Joseph doesn't get paid pretty soon, my rent won't get paid at the end of this month. So that's not going to be fun. If Joseph doesn't get paid pretty soon, my rent won't get paid at the end of this month. So that's not going to be fun. If Joseph doesn't get paid pretty soon, my rent won't get paid at the end of this.
We don't need to repeat that more than once, right?
When do you think we'll be getting any money? I'm like, I don't know. So, yeah, I think it's tougher on her than it is on me. But
Worried about money, worried about making rent. That's the state of mind of a killer in February of 2010. But where is all that money that Joseph's giving for project after project? That's 65%. That's 65% that's now cut to 15%. Look at his bank records. Look at the accounts reports. Look at all of those withdrawals at or near casinos. Joseph Cicada never came in to say that $3,600 deposit or withdrawal or that $1,000 withdrawal was brought to me in cash. Carmen Garcia never said that. Where is all this money going? This is a man who is selfish and self-centered and self-interested and motivated by greed. There was an inference and questions that the money in these transactions were taken out for pay for projects, not gambling. The problem is there is no evidence of that from any vendor. Significant happens in this case. The evidence continues to return and point to the defendant. The forging of checks. Evidence time to commit murder. Time to clean up. All of the phone records activity shows that. Time to move evidence. Familiarity with that area, to his sister's house. Don't bet for a minute that if Bennett could have provided the defendant with an alibi for the 6th, the defense would have called him. Don't bet for a minute that if his sister, Juanita, could have established an alibi for the 6th, she wouldn't have said so when she was called by the people. All of that evidence keeps going back. All of those time periods keeps going back and shows how the defendant had time to forge checks, time to commit murder, time to clean up. Let's talk about the consciousness of guilt that accompanies that and gives it context and full meaning. How about his false statements? His injury to his hand being done at Metro Sheet Metal, where there's no evidence of that. How about his coaching of witnesses?
Anyway, now you know. So yes, now you know. When you get on the stand, you're going to be asked specifically, do you know about this? Yes. You don't have to go into big detail. Tell Raj, you just need to lead me, and he will. He's good.
Well, that other false statement about no location of the graves. You heard about the phone calls. One with his sister, one with Kathy. In one case, he says, I didn't know where they were until I learned this way. And in the other call, he says, well, I wasn't where until his sister told him. Couldn't even keep his story straight to his own family members. How about the changing of identity search on his phone? When the heat goes on, when the bodies are found, he has to look down to change his identity and potentially leave the country with the searches for how to cross the border to Alaska without crossing an international border. Well, wait a minute. You already heard evidence he had a passport and could go to Saudi Arabia to do that install, why would he need a passport? Why do you need to get to Alaska without having to cross the international border and potentially be identified? More importantly, in looking at the totality of all of the circumstances, no one better can tell you about the disappearance of the McStays than the defendant.
You were the last person he saw.
I'm definitely the last person he saw.
When you left your house this morning, can you be sure that your loved ones, that you were the last person that saw them that day? It's been many hours. They could have seen the garbage man come down the street, wave to them. They could have seen the postman come deliver the mail. They could have gone to school or work or whatever they do about their lives. How can you assertively tell someone, I was definitely the last person to see them alive, unless you're the killer? Because the last person to see them alive was in fact the killer. The person who took that sledgehammer to the skull of a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. Think about that in the context of talking about him in the past tense. Take that statement in the context of forging checks and cashing them. Take that in the context of attempting to delete the QuickBooks accounts, which makes no sense for Joseph's business practice. Take that in the context of his phone pinging off a tower overlooking the graves and having no alibi. Take it in the context of, I've never driven that trooper, yet my DNA is in a place consistent with being a driver. Take that into the context that there has been no evidence offered that touch DNA would survive in those graves compared to that found in the car. Because ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, not only does all of the facts in this case and all of the evidence in this case continue, no matter which way you look at them, continue to point back to the defendant. The only reasonable interpretation of anything that's even borderline, the only reasonable interpretation is that it points to guilt. Because in the totality of all of that evidence, the defendant is the linchpin to all of those pieces of evidence. It all comes back to the defendant. All of the significant pieces, all of the significant times. Remember, we don't have to prove when this occurred, how this occurred, or where this occurred. Just that the defendant did it. And what evidence is there to show that he actually did it? And over this morning into this afternoon, I've laid out to you that timeline. He has a connection to these victims, a familiarity with these victims, that gives him not only the opportunity to kill them, but the motive to kill them. When you're talking about Joe. Again, there's no reason to kill those kids unless they're the ones that can identify the killer. And the person they know is the person sitting in this room, Charles Merritt. He's clearly being sidelined from this business. You've seen it even through their own expert accountant. When you look at those spreadsheets that were recovered from the computer, there is no other reasonable interpretation of that February 1st email than you owe me $42,000. And it makes logical sense when you see the fact that it modified the Provetro disaster to $19,000 in light of the defendant's statement as well. You see that he's in debt. You saw the financial analyst from Mr. White analysis from Mr. Weitzman when we called him. You saw the spending patterns. You heard how unreliable he was on projects, how he was missing in action from Metro Sheet Metal. You heard from Joe Cicada. Well, you can keep paying him if you want to, but we're doing all the work. Maybe that's what explains the cut to 15%. He's off the grid on February 4th, when presumably those murders occurred. He was off the grid at that opportunity for 3.5 hours. After which there's no contact from Joe or Summer, no other human contact, no other computer activity, no other financial activity, no other phone activity. And where's the defendant? Nobody knows. He's the one that benefited from all the forged checks. He's the one that benefited from the QuickBooks activity, to the tune of several $1,000s. No one else. Dan Kavanaugh didn't benefit from it. Mike McStay didn't benefit from it. Susan Blake didn't benefit from it. None of those checks were written out to them. He's again off the grid on February 5th, when more checks that he benefits from are written and deleted and backdated to the 4th. He does everything he can to cover the tracks in QuickBooks to benefit him for forging those checks, backdating them to the 4th, deleting them and then printing them and then deleting them, thinking they're going to disappear from the QuickBooks registry miraculously. He tried to delete that account, cancel that account, hide that evidence in any way. Is there any reasonable interpretation that the person that called QuickBooks from the defendant's cell phone was not the defendant? Absolutely not. And you remember how he was told, the customer service agent, Ryan Baker, was told how desperate the person was, and that's why he wrote it in, or insistent the person was, because he wrote it in all caps, needs it to be deleted. And remember back, the significance of covering up all this QuickBooks activity is really a big linchpin to this case, along with the cell phone activity. Think about the context. In February of 2010, he tells Detective DeGaulle that the purpose for changing up how QuickBooks was done was to hide it from Summer. Not Dan Kavanaugh, Summer. Okay, where's the evidence that Summer had any access to any of this? Why would he have QuickBooks shipped to his house, even though it's the old house, not the new house, where Summer lives, and would see it arrive? Why wouldn't he just go to the store and buy his own? Put it on the computer? It makes no sense. Again, another fabrication. Because all of the activity the defendant did in QuickBooks to print, backdate, delete, try to cancel, try to delete the QuickBooks was all a failed attempt to cover his tracks. You have a truck that cannot be excluded. You have a truck that cannot be excluded from the Mitchley video. You have a truck that cannot be excluded from the tire depressions out in the desert. Is it conclusive proof? No. But is it compelling and reasonable interpretation that it is in fact the defendant's truck, given the unique characteristics, the timing, the location? When you take it in comparison to the other evidence that the defendant benefits from, like the writing of the check that didn't end up getting printed, but it was attempted to be written to the defendant, the unique characteristics of that truck that causes that shadow, that low-hanging tailpipe that's consistent. He's off the grid on February 6th when his phone is pinging in the high desert. You heard no evidence that his phone was lost or stolen. You heard no evidence that he was home in Rancho Cucamonga. You heard no evidence that he was at his sister's or his brother's. He's on that grid in the high desert on February 6th, pinging off a tower overlooking the grave sites. What is the reasonable inference from that evidence? Well, with heavy rains, maybe he's checking on the condition of the bodies he buried there, make sure they weren't washed up. It is a wash area. Maybe he's actually burying them on that day. Possible. It's a reasonable inference. Is there conclusive proof? No. But in that circumstance, when you put it together with all of the rest, what's the explanation? It all comes back to the defendant. Again, that QuickBooks call to delete. Off the grid again, twice on February 8th. In the morning for a good number of hours. Then, middle of the day, he's forging checks to himself that he then ultimately cashes, that are backdated to the 4th, and then off the grid for the rest of the evening into the next day. Could that trooper have been moved by him to San Ysidro during that time period? Absolutely. Could he have had help doing it? Sure. Could he have taken public transportation or a taxi back? Sure. The only reasonable explanation of his being off the grid and has not been countered by any credible, relevant, admissible evidence in this trial that you've heard gives him every opportunity to put that trooper and the ability to put that trooper at the border. And the explanation for that is only bolstered by the fact that his DNA is found in that trooper in a position consistent with driving. He has that guilty conscience that I just went through. The false statements about the locations of the graves. The false statement about the injury to the hand. The false statement about who was the usual driver of the trooper. Potentially false statement about trying to hide the business from Summer. You have no other evidence of any of those things being true, even though he wants to put it up there. He puts up there in those statements things that have to be true to explain evidence that points to his guilt. He has to make Joseph the usual driver of the trooper in order to explain why he would have been in it at some point, leaving potentially evidence behind. Even though it's inconsistent given the car seats, given the checkbook, given the fact that he had already had checks given to him on previous days. How about the fact when the heat is on, he's looking to bug out of the country without being identified? How about he's trying to change his identity? How about the fact that he's coaching Kathy Jarvis to remember specific things? When you heard that meeting, she wasn't real clear that she remembered much, if all, or any of those things they wanted her to testify to. But miraculously she did after that visit and an 8-hour visit with defense counsel. And then again, ladies and gentlemen, would it have been nice to have a bloody crime scene? Sure. Would it have been nice for Detective DeGaulle to seize a piece of evidence, kick in a door, explode a Blue Star bomb? Sure. But that's not what the state of the evidence is. And we cannot, as advocates, stand up here and ask you to speculate what the results of any of that would be. We cannot ask you to speculate that DNA is a mixture in order for a random number generator to come up with up to 11 possible contributors. That would be speculative, because it's not a DNA profile. What you have, ladies and gentlemen, is an overwhelmingly convincing set of circumstantial evidence that no matter which way you look at it, no matter which way you turn the wheel, it always comes back to that center point being the defendant. It always comes back to the man with the means, the motive, and the opportunity to commit that murder. And there is no dispute that this is first-degree murder. Regardless of what precipitated the murder of the first person in that house, the other three clearly were willful, deliberate, and premeditated. Especially when you're talking about a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. Justice in this case was delayed by burying those victims in a desert, miles from their home, where they decomposed in those graves for 3 years, 9 months. It's time to render that justice. It's time to, based on the evidence that's been presented to you, to recognize the brutality of the defendant's actions and the superficiality of his motives, his greed, and his self-interest. It is after a full consideration of all of that evidence and all of that circumstances in connection with each other to render the one true and just verdict in this case. Guilty of first-degree murder for Joseph, guilty of first-degree murder for Summer, guilty of first-degree murder for Gianni, and murder in the first degree for Joseph Jr. Thank you.
I assume the defense would prefer to start your arguments fresh tomorrow morning.
I'm ready to start. Now,
Okay.
get it going.
Okay.
Give me 5 minutes to set up.
Sure.
We have a 5-minute recess.
Sure. We'll take a 5 or 10 minute recess and let you go ahead and start.
Five minutes.
Doesn't get